Welcome to StopFake, the place where we set the record straight on disinformation about Ukraine. I'm Peter Dickinson with our latest roundup of Russian alternative reality. Our stories this week include a Russian take on the recent EU-Ukraine summit. A complete disaster, according to the Russian media. We debunk claims that Ukraine is trying to blackmail the EU and look at a bizarre Russian claim about grain harvests. To begin, summit failure, a most dire summit, a summit that ends in zilch or zero. This is how scores of Russian media described the EU-Ukraine summit that took place in Kiev last week. Focusing on what they called the growing disagreements between Ukrainian and European politicians and the lack of a final communique, Russian media generally concluded that the summit ended in disaster. Russian site Vesti called the summit the biggest failure since such summits began 19 years ago. In typically understated fashion, Lenta.ru called the now ratified EU-Ukraine Association Agreement long-suffering and claimed EU officials talked exclusively about corruption during the summit. Their verdict was clear: a dead end in EU-Ukraine relations. Meanwhile, the absence of a final summit communique revealed fundamental differences between members of the European community, declared RIA Novosti. Moskovsky Komsomolets proclaimed that Ukrainian diplomacy has exhausted Europe. Life News announced that Ukraine's European aspirations ended in scandal. And Russian Defense Ministry organ Zvezda said the EU summit ended in zilch. Despite the fact that the summit did not produce a final communique, the EU presented quite a different picture. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said Ukraine had taken more steps in the last 3 years than in the previous 20 and should be proud of what it's achieved. The Wall Street Journal wrote that the absence of a final statement was insignificant in light of what has been accomplished. Politico noted that while the summit celebrated Ukraine and the EU's growing closeness, it also highlighted some tensions between the two sides. The European online newspaper EU Observer pointed out that the summit was, first and foremost, about deepening ties between Ukraine and the EU. The association agreement between the bloc and Ukraine has now been ratified by the European Union and is already being implemented, resulting in a 17% trade increase in the first quarter of this year alone. Hardly a disaster. If you don't give us money, we'll go to Russia. Ukraine blackmails West with EU membership, declared a recent headline on Russian internet publication Inforeaktor. Accompanied by a photograph of Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko, this story is a classic example of Russian disinformation, combining fake quotes and obscure experts. The report implied that Poroshenko really said, "If you don't give us money, we'll go to Russia," while meeting with EU leaders. The Ukraine president said no such thing. So who is the author of this phrase? His name apparently is David Gieberman, and he's a political commentator on a number of Russian fringe sites. But first things first. The Inforeactor story cites an opinion piece on Ukraine-EU relations by one Yevgen Yaroshenko, an analyst from the International Center for Policy Studies. Writing on the centre's official website, Apostrophe, Yaroshenko connects the association agreement with EU membership and concludes that while the latest EU-Ukraine summit didn't bring Ukraine's membership bid forward, it maintained the existing status quo between Kiev and Brussels. Inforeactor takes Yaroshenko's weak analysis and declares that Europe's largesse towards Ukraine has dried up. Inforeactor then asks political analyst David Gieberman to explain how much longer Europe will endure Ukraine's antics. To use a direct quote from the article, Gieberman claims that within a few years, everyone will be getting tired of this circus and will, quote, return these precious neo-Europeans to Russia. Europe has given Ukraine all the political and economic indulgences it can, he claimed. Ukraine will take what it can before returning to Russia. So who is David Gieberman, you may well ask? For the last few months, Mr. Gieberman, if he is in fact a real person, has been very busy commenting for all sorts of second-tier Russian sites such as Anna News, Anti-Maidan and Putin Russia. There appears to be no trace of him prior to April 2017. We were unable to find any information about who he is or what his credentials may be. And finally, agriculture. The Russian media is very fond of drawing bizarre conclusions when trying to explain internal Russian problems. Reporting recently on this year's anticipated lower Russian grain harvest, the newspaper's Vzhlyad concluded that Russian farmers' losses will be compensated by the fact that Ukraine, too, will have a smaller grain crop this year because of bad weather. The logic of the article was clear. Russia wins because Ukraine loses. Cold weather really has impacted this year's EU wheat harvest estimates. According to the International Grain Council, the overall grain yield in 2017-2018 will shrink by 4%. As one of the leading producers of grain in the world, Ukraine will also see drops. However, this year's smallest harvest will not impact on Ukraine's internal food situation, says Deputy Minister for Agrarian Policy Maxim Matinyuk. Ukraine currently exports 48% of the grain it grows, achieving record grain crop levels over the last few years, Martinyuk points out. Ukraine's 2017 grain harvest has yet to even be collected. How it will impact on Russia's grain crop realities, if at all, is beyond anyone's guess. But if you believe Vzhlyad, the Russian farmer will come out on top no matter what, because Ukraine's loss is Russia's gain. And that's all for this week. Be vigilant and beware of fakes. If you spot any, send them to us. I'm Peter Dickinson, and this is StopFake. Thank you for watching.